Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I want to continue with the Booker long list and talk about Trust by Hernan Diaz. Now I have spoken about this book briefly in a weekly wrap-up before. This will be a slightly longer version, I guess. And also just as a quick heads up that I'm going to try and keep this relatively spoiler free, but if there are any bits that I think are really quite spoilery, I will announce that before they come. But anyway, Trust by Hernan Diaz, and this title already sort of gives us a little bit of a clue unintentionally, well, intentionally, but in a way that you might not automatically notice, which is that the trust here also refers to things such as trust funds. And this book deals quite a lot with the idea, with various ideas around economics and finance, and particularly sort of bust and boom economics of various times. And this book is in itself quite a weird beast. It is split into 4 parts. Some of the opening bits of this book really feel like, what on earth am I reading? Because you are reading someone basically talk about the economic principles that have underpinned where they see sort of large economic growth in the US and further afield. And so at first you might think this feels a bit like a textbook, but actually there's something more interesting, I think, going on behind the surface. And this book really, in its approach, uses these 4 books to sort of play around with the idea of narrative in a way that I think is quite interesting. Books that do this can often be quite tricky and sort of tricksy in some ways. So, for example, House of Leaves has quite a few sort of interlinking books, or we might have something like To Paradise. But whereas I think those books within books are sort of so huge and sprawling, the ones in Trust are sort of kept a bit smaller, and that really allows this, I think, to grow. So let's go and talk a little bit about these books. So as I mentioned, we start with this sort of description of sort of economic principles, and we slowly sort of behind the scenes start getting the idea that maybe this character knows more than is sort of being let on, but also that there are other things happening sort of all around them. So, for example, we start to see how they are really proud of having created this economic system that is sort of faultless and will all go well, and we know at this point that this is happening before 1933, and so therefore before the Great Depression and or the 1930s rather, so before the Great Depression and before various other things coming up. So we already sort of know, and we're sort of primed as an audience, that something's going to be wrong, in the same way that if you read pretty much any sort of novel based in the US within the last 20 years that is sort of around this time, we know that every time a character says everything's going to be fine at around the year 2000, early 2001, we know that that's not going to be the case, because we know 9/11 is coming. And in some ways this book does the same thing of playing with the audience in terms of, we know a good amount more. The sort of dramatic irony of knowing exactly what's coming means that we sort of undercut the central characters almost straight away. But what starts becoming quite apparent as we go through the book is that there are sort of also other multiple layers. So we've got this one character trying to sell himself as this absolute expert. We already know this is going to be bogus because of what's coming sort of historically. But then we start learning a little bit more about the other people in his life. We suddenly start realizing that behind every great man there is a woman, and in this case a woman who's doing most of the hard work and has sort of created many of the fail-safes that allow them to be okay, or to make even more money, or what have you. And we start seeing again that sort of the sort of bolshiness, I guess is not really the word, but the sort of this arrogance of some of the men in the book will sort of be their downfall, because actually they're not really listening to the very sage advice going on around them. And then we start getting this becoming even more layered, where we're told that one of the women is sort of, we kind of get the sense that she's going to be more important to the story, particularly as we start realizing that this man is ignoring her increasingly, or trying to very sort of arrogantly tell his story. And that's when we get the role of the biographer. And I think it's often quite interesting when you get a character who is an insert in the book as a biographer, because obviously that in some ways is also the role of the novelist within the book, right? That Hernan Diaz is is telling us a story and letting somebody tell their own story. But in doing so, he's also embedded a character in there who is taking notes and writing this up. And we're again meant to realize that this man is pretty odious. He sort of walks around saying, well, you know, the crash would have been far worse if it hadn't been for me, and all of these other things. And we again start to think that something else is kind of quite fishy here, not only because we know that's not true, but also he is so, you know, full of himself and kind of wanting to be portrayed as this really charitable man, and, you know, even asking this biographer, well, yes, my partner, she does these things, and let's write her up a bit. But also I want it to be really clear that I am a philanthropist, and I'm, you know, really generous and kind, but also very clever and doing all of these things. And so she, you know, our biographer is sort of our eyes and ears in this book in many ways as well. She's us in the book. She's also sort of Hernan Diaz, and she spends a lot of the time sort of being like, well, this man makes no sense. He is not really doing this right. I'm going to write down some of the things he says. Whether it actually ends up in the book quite the way he wants it to be, let's see. And so we start building more and more of a case for this within the book, which then starts to set up our final part of the book, knowing that we are going to hear from this woman herself, and some more about her own life. And by hearing a bit more about her, we sort of start to realize a bit about how some of these parts of the story are connected. The four books almost sort of open up like Russian dolls into a little bit more of the story. So we start with what we think is this whole, you know, going to be the whole story. We slowly find out other characters who are peripheral, and then sort of slowly go back through, and we realize that there's a sort of thread tying all of our characters together. But ultimately also we know historically what's going on, and so we know that this is not going to be perfect. We know, in fact, quite a lot of things are probably going to go wrong. And so I think that's actually what I found so engaging about this book, is it didn't have to be told as sort of four different books with sort of quite different narrative styles or anything like that. It didn't have to do that, but I actually think it's really to this book's credit, because I think it then allows each sort of person's arc or kind of sort of character development in some way to breathe, because we get the snarkier sides of someone who is so done with writing this biography. We also get the sort of bloviating self-importance of this man, thinking he basically solved the world's financial issues whilst also causing them. We get this sort of these other details sort of peppered throughout the book, and we sort of get the commentary on it. And I think that's what I really enjoyed, is this book almost allows us to keep moving through history, commenting on what's come before, in a way that I just thought was really quite fascinating. So I really loved this book, as you can tell. It was sort of, again, a 5-star for me. I felt very happy by the sense that when the long list came out, the 4 that I'd already read were all 5-star reads for me, which bodes well. And I think there'll probably be a few more 5 stars given by me by the time I get to the end of the long list. I think it's a wonderful book, Trust, and I really hope that it makes the shortlist, because I think it deserves it. I can get that from some people's point of view, it sort of feels perhaps like it's maybe over promising in what it's going to try and achieve, and it's sort of this very ambitious sort of thing to try and do, and then actually ultimately it's just 4 different characters speaking. But actually I think it's really important for that reason, because I think those 4 characters have to be separated so that we can chart a proper route through history within the book. So I loved it, as you can probably tell, and I will leave that there. But I've been Bob the Booker, talking about Trust by Hernan Diaz. I'm going to be talking more about the rest of the long list. Apologies, normal service will resume once we're a little bit clearer out of Booker season. But for now, I've been Bob. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this book, and take care. Speak to you soon. Bye bye.